Does affirmative action hurt the chances of students like you getting into top schools? I thought we'd talk about that with Robert Schmad, who is campus reform correspondent and a student at Emory University. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Lars.
You make the point that you're half Asian and half Hispanic. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you make that point. Should it be important to a school or anybody else what your racial or ethnic background is?
You know, it really shouldn't be. The way I see it, what universities should be selecting on is the characteristics individuals have that can be used to advance their mission of, advancing human knowledge. And I think what we're seeing is, a month or so ago, the global university rankings came out, and we saw a bunch of American universities that had formerly been in the top 100 have their roles supplanted by Chinese universities. And these Chinese universities, they don't care, what you look like. They care about, how intelligent you are, really, your merit. And I think, long term, if the United States and our institutions continue this obsession with race and, where you're from what patch of dirt your grandfather came from, if we continue that obsession, we're going to continue to fall behind China. And I don't think that's a world I want to live in, looking towards my future.
No, and I don't want to live in that kind of world either, Robert. I mean, I've made my living. I've advanced through life, and I think I've done very reasonably well, but I've done so based on merit. Not where I was from or, what color I am or what schools my mom and dad went to or anything like that. My dad went to the University of Missoula, so or University of Montana in Missoula. So it's not exactly like Stanford or Harvard or Yale. So, this whole idea that you get some kind of special status because of race or ethnicity ought to be offensive to Americans who actually believe in a constitution that says we're all equal under the law. And yet this idea is being thrown out by advocates, primarily advocates for people of color, or they say they are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. My mom came here from Malaysia in the 90s, wanting to live the American way, has, worked very hard since then. My great-grandfather came up here from Mexico in the 40s, served this country in Vietnam and Korea. I think something they both believed in is impersonal institutions that will treat you equally, regardless of what you look like or where you're from. And I think for a long time, that's what America has been about. And oddly enough, people who call themselves progressives are trying to take us in totally the opposite direction. It would, I think, in my mind, totally turns on its head what it means to be an American. It shouldn't be, the institutions that we are designating as I suppose the people who determine what we're supposed to determine all these important things. When they're selecting on race, that it doesn't reflect well on America or the American way. And I'm hoping the Supreme Court will put an end to that in this coming session.
Well, I hope they do too, because it seemed the court seemed very open to the idea. And in fact, who was it? One of the justices even said, "What if I said I identify as Native American?" He said, because my family's always told me that there's some Native American in our family line, our family tree. And the lawyer, I think it was for Harvard, said, or it might have been the University of North Carolina, said, well, that wouldn't be honest. And I said, well, how much less honest is it to say I'm accorded some special privilege because I'm a person of color, or you are to be accorded some additional shackles or some additional hurdles because you happen to have white skin? I mean, I think all of that is just so un-American, I can't imagine it.
Yeah, it's insane. And I forget who did the survey, but somewhere out there, they polled a bunch of college students, and something like a third of white college students admit to essentially lying about their ethnicity. And, by and large, people who are attending college aren't these, cynical, realists. A lot of times they're bleeding heart progressives. And I can tell you from personal experience, there are a lot of, white liberal students, often from very wealthy families on my campus, who will say oh yeah, I said I was Native American, or I said I was Hispanic to get a leg up in college admissions. And I think that's really telling, because these are the same people who will deny that affirmative action, functions in that way, when in reality it really is just giving a leg up to people who are already privileged, who either A, happen to be from a minority background, or can just lie about it without any real scrutiny being applied.
Up to a third. Robert, do you know what passe blanc is? Have you ever heard of that?
I do not.
Okay, it
white
means,
passing, I think, would be.
Yeah, it's white passing. And okay. There was a time, an ugly time in America, where if somebody was a person of color and light complected, they might have skills and talents that were amazing, but they couldn't get very far if they said, but I'm a person of color, because they were actively discriminated against. So they would pass as white. And he said, well, that was terrible. In fact, I think Anthony Hopkins did a great fictional movie about that whole idea. that didn't turn out well. But I mean, the movie was good. But the idea that you should have to pass as something you're not in order to get ahead, in some ways, if that's the equation we're being built into, in some ways, I can't blame that 1/3 of college kids who said, yeah, I lied about my background because I want to get into college and I'm smart enough to get into college. Let me in. And if you want to make me pretend to be something I'm not, if that's what it takes, some lying. But then we're encouraging people to be dishonest because you're setting up, I think, what the lawyers call a moral hazard. You're saying if you'll lie and say, yeah, I think I've got some Native American or I'm Pacific Islander or something else, then you get ahead. And if you're not willing to do that, other people will get ahead.
Certainly, and I'll be honest. Like I have I've been met with a sort of similar dilemma. Like when I go through all these application forms, because often there's a race column where you can check off your race, and an ethnicity column where you can check off your ethnicity. So I'll usually say prefer not to state the race, and then check the Hispanic box because it really does come down to like I'm proud of my heritage, I'm proud of what my grandfather did, I'm proud of what my mother did. But at the same time, like I don't want to be discriminated against by again these extremely powerful institutions. So it's not lying to say prefer not to say, but it shouldn't even be something that we're thinking about, what race I'm putting on a form. It isn't relevant at all to higher education, isn't relevant at all to, applying for a job outside of college. So I think you're right, yeah.
Well, and think about this. Do you think there's any real mystery as to why a woman named Elizabeth Warren marked on her Texas bar card, and she made the mark herself that she was Native American? Why? Because it would get her ahead in certain circles. And we now know that was just a bald-faced lie. She claims it was misunderstanding about her, her family's heritage. But that's ugly when you've actually dangled something out in front of people saying, hey, if you'll tell us you're something, some category that will get you ahead, we'll give you a reward for it. I think that's a terrible thing to do to people. I think it really cheats the kid, young man or woman who says, well, I'm just white. Well, then you're going to have to get much higher grades because otherwise, if, as you pointed out in the piece that you wrote, what was it? That if an Asian American male had a 25% chance of admission to Harvard, his chances would increase to 36% if he was white with the same grades, or 95% if he was black. That's setting up gigantic moral hazard, I think.
Yeah, certainly. To that point, I believe that was Peter Archiadano from Duke University. His research is being cited, in the proceedings right now. I really do think the people being left most behind by affirmative action are poor white and poor Asian students, because a lot of the times they can't compete with wealthier students who have access to private schools, private tutors, two parents at home who are supporting them with all these resources when maybe they're working a job or two to help keep their family afloat. So really, I mean, if universities wanted to help, people who genuinely needed it and do have real merit, because, it takes a lot to overcome that and still get into college, they would be selecting on, economic variables, not race. Race is a crude proxy that doesn't really capture, I think, what they're trying to capture. And at the same time, like, again, speaking as a student, there are a lot of just wealthy African-American and Latino students from places like Manhattan, places like Malibu on my campus who, no doubt benefited from affirmative action and maybe got a leg up over some, poor white kid from the Rust Belt, which I don't think is right.
Hey, Robert, before you go, what are you studying at Emory?
Political science and statistics.
Now, does that mean you're going to be a politician or a pollster?
Neither, hopefully. Hoping to get into journalism.
Well, I wish you well. And Robert, thanks for the time tonight.